The taste of engine grease never leaves your mouth after the third week. That is the first thing I want you to understand. Not the fear, not the hunger, not even the betrayal, though those came later, and worse. No, what marks the beginning of understanding what happened to us is that particular flavor, like licking a Prometheum drum while someone slowly crushes your chest. I still taste it now, decades later, when I wake in the night. The Medicae says it is psychosomatic. I say, the grease got into my blood and never left. My name was Corporal Venris Thane of the 47th Canuck Rifles, before I became what I am now, a voice in a recording, a testimony for some administratum archive that will be buried in a vault and forgotten. Perhaps you are the poor scribe tasked with transcribing this. Perhaps you found it by accident. Either way, you should know that what I tell you is not complaint. Complaint implies there was someone to complain to, some system that might have listened. This is something else entirely. We were 3,000 souls aboard the Resolute Burden when we left Canuck Prime. Infantry, mostly line troops, meant for the grinding meatwork of the Imperium's endless wars. Our destination was a world called Thrace 4, where some manner of uprising required the personal attention of several regiments. Standard deployment, standard expectations. We had been briefed that the voyage would take 7 weeks through the Imperium, that we would arrive, fight, probably die, and that our sacrifice would be noted in the appropriate ledgers. 7 weeks. I remember how simple that sounded. The Resolute Burden was old. Every troopship in the subsector was old vessels built when the current Lord Governor's great-grandmother was still learning her catechisms. The Munitorum did not waste young ships on moving bodies to their graves, but this one felt different. The corridors sweated a kind of oily condensation that the maintenance serfs could never explain. The lights flickered in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if the ship was trying to communicate something in a language we could not parse. And there was a sound, very faint, that you could only hear in the deep hours when the engines cycled down a grinding, rhythmic pulse that did not match any mechanical system the engineers would acknowledge. I asked our squad's technical specialist about it once, a woman named Hallis who had served 3 campaigns and had replaced both arms below the elbow with standard-issue augmetics. She just shook her head and told me not to ask questions that would attract attention. From what? She did not specify. Our regiment was the 47th Canuck Rifles, and we had a reputation for surviving. Not for glory, not for heroism survival. The Canuck system produced soldiers who understood that the Imperium did not reward the dead, no matter what the chaplains claimed. We kept our heads down, followed orders precisely enough to avoid punishment, and looked after our own. This pragmatism had carried us through 2 previous deployments with acceptable casualty rates. Commissar Hendricht despised us for it. He was young, the worst kind, fresh from the Schola Progenium with his cap badge still shining, assigned to the 47th to instill proper martial spirit as the deployment orders stated. I saw the orders myself when I was carrying documents for Lieutenant Voss. The previous Commissar had been killed on Canuck Prime during a training accident that no one could quite explain, and Hendricht was our punishment for whatever sins the regiment had accumulated. He walked among us in those first days like a predator learning a new hunting ground. Black coat pristine, bolt pistol gleaming at his hip, that terrible peaked cap casting shadows over eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. He did not introduce himself to the men. He simply appeared and began watching, recording our names in a little leather notebook, making notes we were never permitted to see. I remember the first execution. Private Torren had been found sleeping during his watch rotation. A venial sin, the man had been on double shifts due to a rotation error, and exhaustion had claimed him for perhaps 20 minutes. Under our previous Commissar, this would have meant a beating, extra duties, perhaps a formal reprimand. Commissar Hendrick assembled the entire company in the ship's main cargo bay and shot Torin through the forehead while reading from the Imperial infantryman's uplifting primer about the sacred duty of vigilance. The body was left where it fell for 6 hours as an educational display. That was week 1. The ship's translation into the Imperium happened on the 8th day, and everything began to go wrong in ways that seemed, at first, merely unfortunate. The Geller field fluctuated nothing dangerous, the tech priests assured us. Just the expected degradation of a vessel approaching its 7th millennium of service. But the fluctuations coincided with the dreams. I do not know if you have ever traveled through the warp aboard a vessel with an unstable field. The materium and immaterium do not mix well, and even the smallest breach in the bubble of reality that protects a ship can let things seep through. Not daemons, not at first just impressions. Emotional residue. The ship had carried millions of soldiers over its lifetime, and many of them had died during transit. Their fear had soaked into the bulkheads like engine grease, and during those fluctuations we could taste it. The nightmares were communal. 3,000 soldiers dreaming the same dream, endless corridors that twisted back on themselves, doors that opened onto void, hands reaching up through metal floors. We would wake screaming in unison, and the sound would echo through the troop decks like the ship itself was crying out. Commissar Hendrick addressed this by ordering that any soldier who cried out during sleep would be flogged for disturbing unit cohesion. After 3 nights, we learned to wake silently. It was during the 2nd week that I first noticed something wrong with the navigation. I was not supposed to know anything about the ship's course. Such things were above my station, above my clearance, above my right to ask. But I was assigned to a work detail scrubbing the deck outside the navigation chapel, and I heard the arguments through the thin walls. The navigator, whose name I never learned, was screaming at someone, Captain Verhoeven, I believe, about something called the Astronomicon. Even now, years after surviving what came next, my understanding of navigator business remains fragmentary. But I understood enough to know that losing sight of the Astronomicon meant losing sight of Holy Terror itself, meant wandering blind through the Immaterium with nothing to guide us home. The navigator screamed that we were going in circles, that something was pulling us sideways, that the route to Thrace IV, which should have been relatively safe, had somehow become tangled with something older and stranger. Captain Verhoeven told him to keep this information contained. They failed to notice the ratings scrubbing the adjacent corridor, including me. We finished our shift in silence, and afterward, in the darkness of the troop hold where 300 bodies tried to sleep in a space designed for 200, I told Sergeant Collis what I had heard. His face in the dim chemical lighting showed no surprise, only a tired resignation that I would come to know intimately over the following months. How long? He asked. I don't know. The navigator didn't say. No. How long until you heard something you shouldn't? We've been on this coffin 2 weeks, and you're already collecting secrets that will get you killed. He rubbed his eyes with scarred knuckles. Keep your mouth shut, Thane. Whatever happens, happens to all of us equally. Knowing about it early won't change anything except the quality of your sleep. He was wrong, of course. Knowing changed everything. But I followed his advice and said nothing more. What would I have said? Who would I have told? Commissar Hendrick would have shot me for spreading defeatist rumors. Lieutenant Voss was so far out of her depth that she had stopped giving orders entirely, simply signing whatever papers were put in front of her. The company commander, Captain Aldrin, had locked himself in his quarters 3 days earlier and refused to emerge for any reason. We were alone in the most complete way imaginable. The 3rd week brought the first mutiny. Not among the soldiers. We were too broken, too watched, too afraid of Hendrick's pistol to organize any resistance. The mutiny came from the ship's crew, ratings who had served the Resolute burden for decades, some of them 2nd or 3rd generation Void-born who had never set foot on solid ground. They understood the ship's moods in ways we surface dwellers could not, and they knew something was terminally wrong. The uprising was brief and bloody. Perhaps 200 crew members, led by a bosun whose name was Garrick, attempted to seize the Engineerium and force a translation back to real space. Their reasoning, as I later pieced together from survivors, was that any risk in real space was preferable to whatever was happening in the warp. They were willing to emerge into the void between stars, to send distress signals that might never be received, to slowly starve, waiting for rescue that would probably never come. That was how bad things had become by day 21. Captain Verhoeven responded by venting 3 decks to vacuum, not just the decks where the mutineers had barricaded themselves, all adjacent sections as well. The emergency bulkheads sealed automatically, trapping everyone who happened to be in those areas. Innocent crew, soldiers passing through, serfs, servitors, ratings who had remained loyal. We felt the ship shudder as the pressure equalized. The voxcasters crackled with the screams of the dying, then went silent. When the bulkheads reopened 4 hours later, Commissar Hendrick organized work details to collect the bodies. I will not describe what void exposure does to human flesh. You can imagine, or look it up in whatever technical archive serves your curiosity. What matters is that I spent 11 hours dragging frozen corpses through corridors still rimed with ice from the decompression, stacking them in a cargo bay that had been converted to a morgue. The ship did not have enough crew remaining to perform proper burial rites. The chaplain had been among those vented. We burned the bodies in the plasma furnaces and said nothing. Commissar Hendrick executed 3 soldiers that night for insufficient enthusiasm in corpse recovery duties. I do not know what he saw that indicated insufficient enthusiasm. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps he simply needed to remind us that his authority remained intact while the ship fell apart around us. The grease taste was constant now. I would wake with it coating my tongue, go to sleep with it burning my throat. The water recyclers were failing. That was the official explanation for the flavor that permeated everything. But water recycler failure does not explain why the taste changed with my emotions. Fear made it sharper, despair made it thicker, and in the rare moments when something resembling hope flickered through me, it tasted almost sweet, like promethium mixed with honey. I began to suspect that the ship itself was feeding on us. Week 4 was when the navigator died, or perhaps died is the wrong word. Navigators are not entirely human. Their third eye, the warp eye, makes them something other, something that perceives the immaterium directly. When the Geller field fluctuated badly enough during the 32nd day of transit, whatever protections normally shielded his mind simply failed. I did not witness it directly, but I was close enough to hear the screaming, and later, I saw what remained of the navigation chamber. The walls had been painted in symbols that hurt to look at, rendered in fluids that were not entirely blood. The navigator's body was found in the exact center of the room, arranged in a position that human joints should not have been able to achieve. We were now blind as well as lost. Captain Verhoeven made an announcement that I remember word for word, because it was the last coherent communication any authority figure would make for a very long time. Soldiers and crew of the Resolute Burden. Our navigator has suffered a fatal collapse due to warp exposure. We are currently attempting to determine our position and effect emergency translation to real space. All personnel are to remain at their stations and maintain discipline. The Emperor protects. The Vox cut off. The announcement was never repeated, and Captain Verhoeven was not seen again for 3 weeks. In his absence, the ship began to eat itself. Without navigation, without leadership, without the Geller field functioning at more than 40% efficiency, the Resolute Burden became a dying animal, thrashing in the dark. Different factions emerged among the surviving crew. Those who wanted to attempt blind translation, those who advocated waiting for rescue, Those who had begun worshipping the warp fluctuations as signs from entities they refused to name. The soldiers were caught between all of them, armed but purposeless, trained for ground combat but useless in a void conflict. Commissar Hendrick attempted to impose order through the only method he understood. The executions increased. 5 per day, then 10. He stopped requiring specific charges. Failure of faith became sufficient reason to drag someone before the assembled troops and put a bolt round through their skull. The bodies piled up faster than the plasma furnaces could process them, and soon the converted morgue became a charnel house that had to be sealed due to the smell. I watched Hendrick during these executions, studying him the way one studies a dangerous animal. His face never changed, the same cold expression, the same mechanical precision, the same ritualistic reading from the primer before each killing. But his eyes were different. They had started gleaming with something that looked almost like relief, as if each execution released a pressure that had been building inside him, a pressure I was beginning to understand all too well. The ship wanted death. It was old and tired and filled with the accumulated misery of millennia. Every soul that expired within its hull fed something, and Hendrick had become the conduit. I do not know if he understood this. I do not know if he was a conscious collaborator or simply a tool. What I know is that by the end of the 5th week, he had killed more soldiers than the failed mutiny and the deck venting combined. Sergeant Collis came to me on the 39th night with a proposition. We met in a service corridor near the engine spaces, where the noise of failing machinery covered our whispers. There were 7 of us, all that remained of 2nd Squad after the executions and the accidents, and the 3 who had simply walked into empty cargo bays and never come out. "He's going to kill us all," Collis said. His voice was flat, dead, like a man reading his own obituary. "Not because we've done anything wrong, because he needs to, because the ship needs him to." "What are you suggesting?" asked Private Moore, the youngest of us, barely 19 standard. Suggesting? Collis laughed without humor. "I'm not suggesting anything, boy. Suggestions imply choices. We don't have choices anymore. We only have different ways of dying." The proposal was simple. We would kill Commissar Hendrick before he killed us. In any normal circumstance, this would have been unthinkable. Commissars existed outside the normal chain of command, appointed by the officio prefectus, answerable only to the highest authorities. To raise a hand against one was heresy of the highest order, guaranteed to bring down the wrath of the Imperium upon the perpetrators and their entire unit. But we were lost in the warp. No one was coming to save us, or to punish us. The normal rules had ceased to apply the moment our navigator's mind shattered. "How?" I asked. Collis outlined the plan. Hendrick maintained a rigid schedule even as the ship descended into chaos: morning prayers, inspections, executions, evening lectures on duty and sacrifice. His quarters were on the officer deck, accessible through 2 main corridors and 1 service shaft that the execution details used to transport bodies. We would wait in the service shaft, catch him returning from evening lectures, and what Moore asked. "We can't just shoot him. He's faster than any of us. He's been killing people since before we could hold a lasgun." "We don't shoot him," Collis said. "We take him somewhere the ship can finish him." The thing in the engine spaces had been growing for 2 weeks. None of us knew exactly what it was: a warp intrusion, a failed repair ritual, a manifestation of the ship's diseased spirit. It pulsed with a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of nightmares, and anyone who got too close began hearing voices that offered terrible bargains. Collis wanted to feed Hendrick to it. I should have objected. I should have pointed out that we would be trading one death for another, one corruption for a different kind. But the grease taste was thick on my tongue, and I could feel the ship's hunger like a physical presence, and some part of me, the part that had watched 37 executions and said nothing, wanted to see the Commissar's face when he realized that his authority meant nothing to the thing growing in the dark. When I asked, "Tomorrow night?" During the power fluctuation at third shift, the fluctuations had become regular now, predictable cycles, when the ship's wounded systems tried and failed to compensate for damage they could not repair. During these periods, the lights died, the gravity wavered, and strange sounds echoed through corridors that should have been empty. Perfect cover for murder. We spent the next day in a haze of fear and anticipation. I kept expecting Hendrik to notice something different about us, to single us out with those gleaming eyes and order us to the execution square. But he walked past our squad during inspection without comment, his attention fixed on some inner calculation we could not perceive. That evening, I saw him speaking with Lieutenant Voss, or rather, speaking at her. Voss stood motionless while Hendrik delivered what appeared to be instructions, her eyes empty in a way that suggested she had stopped processing language entirely. When he finished, she simply turned and walked away without acknowledgement. Hendrik watched her go with an expression I had never seen on his face before: frustration. For the first time since coming aboard, the Commissar had encountered something his authority could not affect. The ship was taking his tools away. Night came, or what passed for night in the warp. The lights dimmed to their rest cycle level, and the sounds changed from industrial grinding to something more organic, more wet. We gathered in the service shaft an hour before the scheduled fluctuation, checking weapons we hoped not to use, rehearsing movements we prayed would be fast enough. Collis went over the plan one more time. Hendrik would pass through Corridor 7 Alpha on his return from the lecture hall. Private Moore would create a distraction, a small fire, nothing dangerous, just enough to draw attention. When Hendrik moved to investigate, we would emerge from the service shaft, overwhelm him, and drag him to the engine spaces before he could recover. Simple, direct, almost certainly doomed. The fluctuation began exactly on schedule. The lights died. The gravity flickered, sending us floating for a moment before slamming back to the deck, and in the darkness I heard Hendrik's boots on the metal floor, approaching with the mechanical precision that characterized everything he did. Moore lit the fire. It worked. Sort of. Hendrik broke from his path, moving toward the flames with his bolt pistol already drawn. But he moved faster than we had anticipated, faster than any normal human should have been able to move, and by the time we emerged from the service shaft, he had already extinguished the fire and was turning to face us. The bolt pistol came up. I have replayed this moment in my memory 10,000 times. The flash of the muzzle, the sound like a god's heartbeat, the wet explosion as the round struck Private Moore in the chest and detonated inside him. The boy simply came apart, spraying us with what had been his body, and in that moment of chaos, Hendrik was already firing again. Collis took the second round in the shoulder. It spun him like a top, tearing his arm off at the joint, but somehow he stayed upright, stayed moving, crashed into Hendrik with all the desperate strength of a dying man. They went down together. The rest of us piled on. It was not combat. Combat implies skill, technique, training. This was something older and more primal. We were animals fighting for survival, biting and clawing and screaming, and Hendrik was screaming too, finally showing emotion as we dragged him toward the engine spaces. He killed Trooper Vesh during the transit. Somehow, even with 5 people holding him, he got a hand free and broke her neck with a single twist. But we kept moving, kept dragging, kept pulling him toward the thing that waited in the dark. The engine spaces were different now. I do not know how to describe what we saw. The warp does not follow the rules of material existence, and whatever had been growing there had stopped pretending to be anything mechanical or comprehensible. There were geometries that made my eyes water. There were colors that did not exist. There was a sound like breathing, like praying, like a million voices whispering secrets in languages that predated human speech. And at the center of it, something waited. Commissar Hendrik saw it, and for the first time since I had known him, His face showed fear. Pure, animal terror that stripped away all his training, all his authority, all his certainty. "No," he said. Just that. A single word that contained everything he had denied about this voyage, everything he had refused to acknowledge while he maintained his schedule of executions. We threw him toward it. What happened next I cannot tell you. Not because I do not remember, but because the memory is not sequential, not coherent, not something that can be rendered in human language. There were arms that were not arms. There were mouths that were not mouths. There was screaming that lasted either seconds or centuries, and when it ended, Commissar Hendricht was gone, and the thing in the engine spaces was larger than it had been before, and satisfied. That was the worst part. I could feel its satisfaction like a physical pressure, a sense of fullness that radiated through the ship's systems and made the engines pulse with renewed vigor. We had fed the monster to save ourselves, and in doing so, we had made everything worse. The ship translated out of the warp 3 days later. I do not know why. Perhaps our sacrifice had given it what it needed. Perhaps the navigator's death throes had somehow set us on a course that led to a natural exit point. Perhaps something in the warp simply grew bored with us and spat us out. We emerged into real space far from any system, surrounded by the cold stars of the void between worlds. The resolute burden was dying systems failing one by one, life support deteriorating, structural damage from the warp passage beginning to manifest as hull breaches and corridor collapses. Of the 3,000 souls who had left Canuck Prime, fewer than 400 remained. The regiment had been gutted not by combat, but by the failures of every institution that was supposed to protect us: the ship, the navy, our own officers, the commissariat. We had been abandoned by everyone who should have been responsible for our survival. Captain Verhoeven reappeared on the 3rd day after translation, emerging from wherever he had hidden looking like a man who had aged decades in weeks. He took one look at the state of the ship, the depleted crew, the absence of the Commissar, and simply sat down in the command throne and began to weep. Sergeant Collis, now commanding 2nd Squad by virtue of being the only NCO still alive, took charge by default. He organized the survivors into work parties, began systematic rationing of the failing life support, and sent distress signals that we knew might never be received. The thing in the engine spaces was quiet now, dormant, fed. But we could all feel it waiting. Rescue came 8 weeks later. A patrol cruiser, the Saint Veritas, picked up our distress beacon and found us drifting. By then, we were down to 200 survivors, the rest having succumbed to injuries, exposure, or encounters with the thing that still lived in the engine spaces. The cruiser's crew boarded us with weapons drawn, expecting pirates or worse, and found instead the remnants of a regiment that had survived something they could not explain. The Inquisition took an interest. Of course they did. A ship emerging from an extended warp transit, missing its navigator and commissar. With stories of things growing in the engine spaces, this was exactly the sort of situation that attracted their attention. We were separated, interrogated, mind-scraped, and subjected to tests that I am still not permitted to describe. I survived because I knew how to tell the truth in a way that sounded like ignorance. Yes, the commissar had died. Yes, there had been a warp intrusion. No, I did not know the details. I was just a corporal, just a line trooper, just another body in the hold. What would I know about the things that killed my officers? The inquisitor who processed my case was an old woman with augmetic eyes that recorded everything and revealed nothing. She asked me the same questions 17 times in different phrasings, cross-referencing my answers against whatever data she had extracted from the ship's cogitators and my fellow survivors. At the end of the final session, she leaned forward and said, "You fed him to it, the Commissar." It was not a question. I said nothing. She nodded slowly. The ship's spirit was corrupted beyond recovery. Whatever you fed it likely bought you enough time to escape the warp. You may have saved 200 lives through an act of heresy that would normally warrant immediate execution. Still, I said nothing. I am going to classify this incident as navigator failure with subsequent crew attrition. The Commissar will be listed as killed during the warp incident. You and your surviving squadmates will be reassigned to a penal unit, not as punishment for what you did, but because you now know things that cannot be unknowingly. The penal unit will ensure your silence while giving you the opportunity to die in the Emperor's service. She stood. You should have died in that ship, Corporal. Every one of you should have. The fact that you survived suggests either Emperor's blessing or something else's interest. I do not know which, and I do not have time to determine. So I am sending you somewhere that the question will answer itself. The penal unit was the 13th Cannock Irregular, a punishment formation that existed to absorb the survivors of incidents that could not be officially acknowledged. We were criminals, heretics, witnesses to things the Imperium preferred to bury. They gave us explosive collars and suicide missions, and the certain knowledge that we would never be permitted to return to normal service. Sergeant Collis died in our first engagement, taking a grenade meant for a position that had already been overrun. I think he wanted to die. I think he had wanted to die since the moment we threw Hendrik into the warp thing's embrace. I have survived 19 more engagements since then, not because I am skilled or blessed or lucky, but because the universe has a cruel sense of humor and apparently wishes me to continue tasting engine grease every time I close my eyes. The others are gone now. Every survivor of the Resolute Burden who made it to the penal unit has died in one campaign or another. I am the last, kept alive by a mixture of cowardice and the peculiar protection that seems to extend to those who have bargained with things they should not have. Because that is what we did, isn't it? When we fed Hendrik to that thing in the engine spaces, we made a deal. Life for death, survival for sacrifice. The ancient transaction that predates the Imperium, that predates humanity, that exists wherever desperate creatures encounter powers willing to trade. I do not know what the terms were. I do not know what I owe. But I know that I taste engine grease every morning, and sometimes, in the deepest hours of night, I hear a voice that sounds like the Resolute Burden's screaming hull, whispering that my debt is not yet paid. The regiment failed us. The ship failed us. The Commissar failed us in trying to maintain order through methods that only fed the corruption growing in the vessel's heart. Every institution of the Imperium that was supposed to protect soldiers like us simply collapsed under the weight of incompetence, malice, and cosmic indifference. But we also failed ourselves. That is what I understand now, decades later, recording this testimony that no one will read. When the ship began to die, we should have organized. When Hendrik began his executions, we should have resisted collectively rather than hoping we would not be chosen. When the navigator died and Captain Verhoeven vanished, we should have taken control rather than drifting toward catastrophe. Instead, we waited. We obeyed. We let the systems we had been trained to trust continue operating even as they destroyed us, because we could not imagine any alternative. And when we finally did act, when we finally chose to take our fate into our own hands, we did so in the worst possible way, not building something new, but feeding the darkness something it wanted. There is a lesson there, I think, about the Imperium, about humanity, about the terrible momentum of institutions that have ceased to serve their original purpose. The Resolute Burden was 10,000 years old. It had been carrying soldiers to their deaths since before the current configuration of the subsector, since before the names of our homeworlds had been assigned, since before the very concept of the Cannock rifles existed. It kept moving because no one had ever told it to stop, and we died because we were caught in its momentum. The Commissariat sent Hendrik to instill discipline, but the discipline he instilled was the discipline of fear, which is no discipline at all. The Navy gave us Captain Verhoeven, who hid from his responsibilities until there were no responsibilities left. The administratum assigned us to a ship that should have been decommissioned centuries ago, because the paperwork for replacement would have required someone to take responsibility. Failure cascading through failure, until nothing remained but the desperate choices of people who had been abandoned by everything. I'm going to die soon. The explosive collar they fitted me with has a fail-safe that activates if my vital signs fall below certain thresholds, and I can feel my body giving out after decades of abuse. When I go, the collar will ensure there is nothing left to bury. But before I do, I want this recorded, not as excuse or justification, but as evidence. The Imperium kills its soldiers not just through enemies and warfare, but through the slow accumulation of institutional neglect. Ships fail because no one maintains them, officers fail because no one trains them, commissars fail because no one teaches them that fear is not the same as loyalty. And soldiers like me fail because we never learn that the system designed to protect us was never designed to protect us at all. We are fuel for a machine that has forgotten its purpose, ground up in gears that no longer connect to anything, sacrificed to maintain the fiction that someone, somewhere, knows what they are doing. The resolute burden was destroyed after our rescue, of course. Declared irredeemably corrupted and subjected to cyclonic torpedoes until nothing remained but expanding debris. The thing in the engine spaces died with it, I assume, though I am not certain anything truly dies in the Imperium. Sometimes I wonder if it is still out there somewhere, in some form, waiting for another desperate crew to feed it, waiting for another commissar who values procedure over humanity, waiting for another captain who hides when leadership is needed, waiting for another regiment of soldiers, too trained in obedience to recognize when obedience has become suicide. The grease taste is very strong tonight. It tastes like endings, like the moment before something final. The Medicae gave me something for the pain, but it does not touch the deeper ache, the knowledge that I survived when better people died, that my survival came at a cost I will never fully understand, that somewhere in the warp, a piece of my soul remains in whatever barren we made with the thing that saved us, by destroying the man who was supposed to be our moral compass. I was a soldier of the Imperium. I was supposed to trust my ship, my regiment, my commissar. They were supposed to be the pillars that held everything together, the framework within which sacrifice and duty made sense. When they all failed, there was nothing left but the choice we made in the dark. And I have been tasting that choice ever since.